the areas of justice and inclusion in society. And our the Fundación Paz Ciudadana are going to explain the use of quasi-experimental methodologies for the implementation of public policies to prevent crime. For this, we have here Dr. Cristóbal Weinberg, the director of this area of policing, and we're going to have a joint presentation. And so now I will be sharing these with you.
Cristóbal, can you see it clearly, okay? So the area of justice and reinsertion, made up by two other professionals, a lawyer and a sociologist, and also we have traditionally have an economist among our team. We have developed throughout the last 7 years 4 assessment in a near experimental manner. The first of them was a evaluation of a concession system of the jail vis-a-vis the traditional one in terms of reinsertion. It was a contest in which we applied, the purpose of which was to strengthen institutions through this IDB contest, and we developed in 2013 with a right of receiving funding. The second one was the impact assessment of the multi-systemic therapy program, which was already mentioned in the first day of the conference as one of the programs that have evidence. And the impact assessment was made with the crime prevention and the secretary through a public bidding. And also we did an impact assessment of the courts that treat the issue of drugs in Chile with the IDB funds in 2018. And the last one is the impact assessment of a legal amendment that was in the law 2603 with substitutional penalties that was done through the funding of a so-called Fundación, a grant with the University of Talca and the El Desarrollo University between 2016, and the project ended in 2019. I would like to briefly talk about 2 of these programs or assessment that were near experimental one. Cristóbal will mention the current program that we have in terms of experimental assessment. And I would like to focus on the multi-systemic therapy and the courts that are specialized on the issue of drugs. The multi-systemic therapy assessment wanted to see the impact of this component as to the crime behavior, especially in the so-called LASOS or bond program. That includes many programs, specifically 3 of them aim at the crime prevention in young people. In that context, one of the main programs being implemented is the multi-systemic therapy program that had international evidence in regards to its effectiveness. This program was carried out or implemented from 2012 by the Crime Prevention and the Secretariat, and it was 2017 when the near experimental assessment was commissioned. So how were we able to build a control and treatment group so as to do this near experimental assessment? What we did was to compare children and teenagers that enter in this multi-systemic therapy with those that, having the same inclusion criteria, were not enrolled in this program due to several reasons, mainly logistic, administrative reasons. So in that context, we were able to set up a treatment group with the administrative records of 750 minors and adolescents, and a control group with administrative record of 784 minors and adolescents. So specifically, in the case of the treatment group, we considered those that finished this multisystemic treatment in 2013-14 that would have a risk score assessment through the asset instrument, that is a instrument that is being used by the crime prevention and the secretariat that would have more than 21 points. So that is an instrument that usually has a score that reaches up to 40, but the cutoff scored in order to enroll the program was 21 or more points in a series of dimensions linked to crime risk factors. At the same time, those that belong to the control group corresponded mainly to those that were under evaluation, because part of the LASOS program was we had envisioned the design of evaluation that applies for this instrument that is called Enlaces, and that applied the Enlaces. These young people had more than 21 points in that instrument, but they were not enrolled in the program. So you can notice that between the treatment group and the control group, what we searched for was that the allocation criteria were even among these two groups. So both of them should have the same 21 score of the asset. Basic criteria for this enrolling in the program. And then, for the sake of the estimation, in the case of multisystemic therapy, we used different techniques, but the main being was propensity score matching. And why? Because both in the treatment group as well in the control group, there was a need to control through several variables, considering that the groups had certain differences. So what the propensity score matching does is to level the field so that these two groups can be comparable, the treatment and the control group. We used two estimations where we estimated the effect of the program, both for the total population as well as the population that in fact was treated by the program. And in that context, we have the difference among those that were treated and the intention of being treated, and that is acknowledged in the literature, and we search to do the estimation in both groups. As you can notice in the table, the estimation of the relapse of the total population with program was 36.4 and out of 42.7 without program. If we consider only the treated group by the program, the rate of relapse decreases 6 points. That is to say, 43.5 to 37.7, which shows the effectiveness in the reduction of recidivism in the program. What drew our attention had the effect of a specific group, and we saw that where we could observe the biggest effects were in those that were classified as higher risk groups that had scores above, I don't remember specifically, but about 30 or more in the assets, and specifically in the group between 16 and 18 years old. So the last finding was quite relevant because one of the criteria that operated as a prioritization of the program was that it should be young people that were just starting the crime career, so as to say. So one of the priority was to focus on young people that would have less age of penal responsibility, which here is 14 years old. But those above this age were those that corresponded to a more mature group between 16 and 18 years old, and that was one of the main findings of our research. Now, if we continue with the assessment in terms of the drug treatment courts, The evaluation tried to see the relapse rate in the program. Unfortunately, the signal is off apparently. So, between 2009 and 2012. You hear me? Please repeat the last part of the slide because we lost your signal. Thank you, Cristóbal. So, the assessment, as I mentioned, the purpose was to estimate the impact of relapse impact in the courts specialized in drugs in Chile, and they use database of cases flow for the detection of these users in these courts that corresponds to 2009, 10, 11, and 12 that were originally elaborated so as to publish a statistical bulletin. So specifically, the foundation is part of the technical board of the implementation of the court specialized in drugs, and was in charge of elaborating together with the public prosecution, the Ministry of Justice, the statistics. Therefore, we're able to have that information available. Now we'll see the issues that we face at that time. Relapse was considered based on charge or contact obtained thanks to the support of the public prosecution. The treatment group was made up by 739 people and the control group by 571. Just like in the previous case, we needed to have an entry criteria that could operate both for the treatment and control groups. And that was specifically the existence of a biopsychosocial diagnosis compromise. Both groups were assessed by two professionals working in these courts specialized on drugs, and therefore they had that entry common criteria. The difference between these two groups is that in the case of the treatment, these were people that were current and would have dropped out from this program by the court, and the people with the diagnosis of the control group that were not admitted to the program. Once again, we used the propensity score matching. Here you can notice that the user group that participated in this program of the courts, whether they concluded successfully the program or not, they relapsed close to 30% less as compared to the group that didn't participate in the program. There was a drop of 8 points on a total of 29.6 percentile points. So this is the end, this final slide. I would like to mention that one of the main issues that we assessors have when we develop research has to do with the lack of change theory. Most of the programs that were implemented at a domestic level do not have change theory that allows to establish ex ante which will be the intermediate and final outcomes that are desired. Finally, we have problem with data access. Specifically, in the case of the drug treatment program, due to the institutional nature, institutions had different analysis units between subject cases and crimes, or units that were different that makes different to do an assessment. The quality of the data, that is something through which we researchers suffer. There are a lot of data that usually have an important missing, or that these people have been admitted without a previous follow-up. So one of the things that has been difficult for us in this assessment is that we can estimate a relapse or committing crimes again, but most of the time we can't assess through the impact as drug consumption, family, nature, school situation, labor situation, among others. And finally, programs, although they use assessment tools as a pre-treatment variable, usually these instruments or tools are not replicated once the program finalizes, and somewhat that limits the methodology that we use. Thank you for your attention, and now I'll give the floor to Cristóbal. will continue with the presentation in terms of experimental evaluation.
Muchas gracias, Ana María. ¿Se ve la presentación?
Thank you, Ana Maria. Can you see the presentation? Yes. Well, as you were able to see in the first part of the presentation, there is a significant amount of experience in this type of assessment. Although this is an ongoing project, we would like to say that this is a milestone for experimental criminology in Chile, and also the first time that empirically what is known in other countries as hotspot policing does or not work in Chile. We all hope that it works, but we don't know. Well, we will not know until we test it in our areas and data. We will be able to see this. So this experiment has a theoretical aspect to it that we hope will be a contribution to world experience. And I will resume this later on. And lastly, it's important to say that this is financed by the budget division and will be carried out together with Carabineros de Chile. So, as Dr. Ariel was saying, an essential aspect of evidence-based policing is the triple T. This is like the testing. So we're going to use a scientific method for making decisions within the police force. So it's the standard of excellence that we must aim at, has to do with carrying out controlled and random experiments. And throughout the conference, we have seen this time and time again. National and international speakers have said, what is it that we want to implement? So as you see here, this is the essence of any controlled and random experiment. First of all, you need a sufficient sample. Second, randomize to identify experimental groups and control groups, where the only difference is that the experimental group receives a treatment and the control group does not. Now, I apologize for the example, but let's see what happens today. This is what is happening with COVID. One group is going to be given the vaccine and another group is going to be given placebo. So in the sphere of police action, this is the same thing. This is not a vaccine against delinquency, no. But what we are saying is that this strategy, we're going to test it out to see if it does or not work. And afterwards, we're going to analyze the impact. And so therefore, we can compare between the control and the experimental group, and the difference will tell us the actual impact of the intervention. Now, here, as I was saying, our experiment will measure the impact of the preventive action by Carabineros. But first of all, let me share with you certain assumptions regarding this. Now, if we take a look here, you can identify significant areas, hotspots, where there's a significant reduction. Yesterday, when I was preparing the presentation, I found a meta-analysis that came out yesterday, and that shows that estimates within the hotspot policing meta-analysis are overestimated. If the impact is 15 to 25%, we could really be speaking of 30% impact, which is a very good news for researchers in general. But we speak of evidence. What I will try and show you here is concrete evidence and controlled and random experiments. Now, here we see that same as we have hotspot policing evidence, here we have evidence regarding the concentration of crime in cities. And though I will not elaborate further on this, I would like you to be clear about two things. First, that there is sufficient empirical evidence saying that approximately 5% of places in the city concentrate 50% of the crimes. So this is what is called like the law of the concentration of crime in certain areas. And so in Chile, finding similar concentrations and empirically test that this is in fact the case. The search for evidence begins with a geospatial analysis, because here we see the reality of the data, and we must determine baselines of the phenomenon to be measured, in this case, the number of crimes concentrated in places where carabineros patrol. Now, nevertheless, it is insufficient to identify these hotspots. We also want to identify the harm spots. So it's not the same as identifying a hotspot concentrating crime from another, say, theft or homicide or others types of crimes. And so we devised the first crime analysis, or the harm analysis of each crime according to a common denominator. On account of the time and respect for the other speakers that I'm sure that you are waiting, Justice IACA, who will be speaking later, I will not get into how to create a crime harm index, but some used a perception survey or the convictions or expert judgments. But what is important is that of all the options available, the Telemann put forward in 2007, this is a simple answer to a complex issue, and that is that most countries have already done this exercise determining the harm spots. In the case, it has to do with sentencing. And so if you commit a theft, you could go to jail for so many years, or a homicide for so many other years. Now, let me speak to you about the crime harm index. Regardless of the places, we want to know the places that concentrate the harm, and also the victims or the people who commit a crime. These approaches are systemic. They do not aim at only the places. So in simple terms, I would now like to present the first version of the tool that we're expecting to use, or as the Fundación. A new way of understanding, analyzing, and planning crime prevention in Chile, and we're hoping that this may be useful to everyone. As we said on day one, we want to begin applying this index in various spheres. And of course, we need to test whether it does or not work. We have a hypothesis, but we would like to check whether it will or not be useful to public policy in Chile. Here you can see a first approach. The crimes with greatest social connotation in Chile in 2019. And at first, you can see that theft is the main issue, in turn, the most relevant crime, most usual crime. Now, when we apply the index, we see that theft is no longer the most important one, but rather that theft with intimidation is the most usual and that causes most harm to people. So this will change the way that we analyze crimes. And when we speak of targeting, this has to do with precisely that, where to focus our resources. Now, within our investigation in the UK, and that we're going to replicate in Chile, we identified 5 types of areas. One, the known hotspots with a high crime rates. Second, the harm spots where you have a high concentration of harm, but not necessarily frequency, and 3 places in the city that have crime and harm, and other areas where there is no crime, which is also interesting because when you analyze, you have this trend that 5% of places concentrate 50% of the crime, but you never take a look at the places that have no crime. We have 0 crimes in a year. And it is interesting to see what is happening in those places and say, why do they not have any crimes? And lastly, what I would like to focus on today is our priority areas. We've identified as places that have a high concentration of crime and a high concentration of harm. Now, returning to our experiment, the general aim is to assess the efficacy of preventive policing, done by the Carabineros de Chile within the quadrant plan. The specific aim is to first find out the impact of this, and then the dose of the intervention, and 3, the strategies used by Carabineros for their patrolling. And lastly, analyze the cost efficacy of the intervention, because our financiers, DPRES, also ask us to explain every cent spent. Now, the experimental design, I will not get into the detail, but yes, let me tell you that we're aspiring to the gold standard. And so if we achieve this in statistical terms, it's easier to analyze because you already have a preference. So it's very interesting to see what I was saying to Ana Maria regarding the experimental analysis, because the statistical challenge is great. To identify the groups is not easy. But if we do a good experiment, we will skip that exercise and ensure that you have the experimental group and the control group are comparable. And the only difference is the intervention. Now, this is the screen that I showed you at the start when I tried to explain what this experiment, the controlled and random one, was about. The only difference with the original screen is that you have the sample, we have a control group, an experimental group, the intervention, and patrolling. And this should be the only difference between the 2 groups to check whether it does or not work. Now, I apologize for the poor map, but I tried to make it a bit more.
Pero les quiero mostrar a qué nos referimos en concreto con el tipo de intervención que vamos a hacer.
In an investigation with Baraki, Dr. Ariel and Professor Sherman, we discovered that patrolling in crime hotspots must be done 3 to 4 times a day to be effective. And so therefore, that is our first check. When you go to patrol, let me explain. In this map, the red area is where the area of intervention. The gray area is the buffer zone, and where you have 2 options. Either the crime is displaced or there is a dissemination of the benefit of the police action. So if you're able to reduce crime in the red area, we would suppose that it's also coming down in the gray area. And lastly, the green area for 2 hotspots, or in our case, 2 priority areas where you have a high concentration of crime and also a high concentration of harm. We cannot connect them because we cannot control we cannot bring together the control group and the experiment group. The other thing is the Chris Copper investigation, the Copper investigation done in 1995 and replicated several times, and that the optimum intervention in terms of policing is 10 to 15 minutes. From then on, the curve flattens out and has no major effect. And we need to also do this in Chile. Everything I'm saying here, these are premises based on evidence. And so we have to check whether this works or not in Chile. And lastly, ideally, these must be teams of 2. If it's possible to do foot patrol or otherwise by motors, motorbikes, or using cars. So what if we change the recommendations based on evidence? We must do it for the all groups the same. And so our couple of police officers, in this case, enter the priority area. And as you see here, with a GPS device, And let me tell you, we did a similar experiment about 5 years back, and that was the technology that we had at the time. But today, it is much, much better, and the sort of information that we can obtain is much richer. So they enter the area, and the first thing we need to know is information. Who went in? Where did they enter? Was it just experimental or controlled? The date and time of entry to the area, and lastly, to see if they're responding to emergency calls or not. When you read the literature, you find it says business as usual. So with this experiment, what we did not want carabineros to stop doing what they do usually. What we're trying to test is that when we send officers to priority areas, that they should go 3 to 4 times a day, no more than 15 minutes. And then they can, in addition, they can do identity controls or detentions, so that they always have the 133 number with them. But the important thing is that we should have the information in order to do the analysis subsequently. Now, our couple of officers do the patrol, and when they leave the priority area, once again, we should find the same information. This is essential for the tracking and monitoring of the intervention. The experimentant could have the best design in the world, all technology, but if we have a poor monitoring, we've had it. And so what we need to do here is to know where are the police and what are they doing, quite aside from the analysis. And I'm saying it out of personal experience. I do hope to return next year to the conference with further results, but we planned a pilot for this. It takes about 6 months, because in these 6 months, we want to make every error possible to ensure the integrity of the experiment and monitoring. And so with this, I will finish, and then I hand over to Ana María.
Muchas gracias, Cristóbal.
Thank you, Cristóbal.